オンタリオ州の自動車産業は、ゼネラルモーターズが正式に車種の一つの生産を終了することで、新たな打撃を受けている。
カナダの自動車産業は、ゼネラルモーターズがイングレソル工場で電気配送板、ブライトドロップの生産を終了することで、新たな打撃を受けている。
ゼネラルモーターズは、オンタリオ州ロンドン近郊の工場で電気板の生産を中止する。同社は、需要の減少により、電気配送板、ブライトドロップの生産を停止したと述べている。
カナダの自動車産
announcement can sometimes shift the ground beneath an entire community, especially when the people hearing it have already spent years navigating uncertainty they never expected. When a corporation steps back from promises that once shaped long-term plans, the repercussions stretch far beyond a locked gate or an empty parking lot. They flow into homes, unsettle routines, and force a broader reckoning with what kind of country Canada wants to be in an increasingly unstable global economy. That is exactly what happened when a single facility in Ontario fell silent. Its closure exposed far more than a stalled production line. It signaled a deeper shift that caught the attention of anyone watching the direction of North American manufacturing. The shutdown of the Bright Draw facility in Ingersoll became one of those defining moments. The announcement carried a sense of finality that felt almost like a verdict delivered without warning. On October 21st, 2025, General Motors confirmed that the plant would not reopen. There would be no gradual restart, no revised production plan, no alternative model introduced to buy time. Everything that had once filled the site with movement and purpose came to a complete halt. The message landed hardest on a workforce that had believed, for years, that their jobs were anchored in one of Canada's most important industries. The news stunned even those who had watched the long production pause with growing unease. More than 1,200 families saw their stability vanish in a single announcement. Many had spent decades building their lives around the plant, financing homes, raising children, and trusting that their skills were part of the country's industrial future. Some had started long before electric delivery vans were part of GM's strategy. They had weathered economic cycles, adapted to new technology, and invested in training programs because they believed the company's assurances reflected a genuine long-term partnership. Losing their jobs meant far more than losing wages. It meant watching years of loyalty evaporate without explanation. Inside households across the region, the questions multiplied. Parents tried to steady their families even as they faced uncertainty about their own futures. Retirement plans shifted. Savings were reassessed. Daily routines acquired an undercurrent of worry. The sense of being powerless in the face of decisions made far away, and without regard for the people affected, created a deep emotional blow. What made the situation even harder to accept was how strongly the plant had once been promoted as a symbol of a new chapter in Canadian manufacturing. GM had praised the workforce. Government officials had championed the partnership. Billions in public funding had supported the plan, advertised as a milestone for Canada's electric vehicle ambitions. The facility was described as a cornerstone of GM's future in the country, a critical link in North America's EV supply chain. For a moment, it had seemed like a blueprint for revitalizing the industrial economy, but over time, those commitments faded. Each time GM addressed the plant status, the explanation shifted. First, it was a temporary slowdown driven by lower demand. Then came assurances that operations would resume. Later, updates became vague enough to signal that the company's internal strategy had taken a different turn. Production never restarted, even though earlier messages suggested it would. What began as temporary layoffs quietly turned into permanent job losses. The absence of a clear explanation intensified frustration among workers, unions, and policymakers. That silence, for many, echoed a familiar pattern. Canada's manufacturing history is filled with moments when corporations leveraged the fear of job losses to extract concessions. Plants had closed before. Promises had been withdrawn before. Governments, worried about protecting local economies, often agreed to terms that weakened long-term stability for workers. This legacy shaped how the community interpreted GM's withdrawal, less as an isolated incident and more as another chapter in a long-standing imbalance between corporate interests and public commitments. But this time, the response took an unexpected direction. 3 days after GM's shutdown confirmation, the federal government issued a statement that appeared measured and controlled on the surface. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne declared that decisions by both GM and Stellantis had violated commitments made to Canadian workers and the government itself. To the general public, the language may have seemed diplomatic, But to anyone familiar with trade policy, its meaning was unmistakable. Canada were preparing to use one of the strongest tools available. When the rules were applied, the effect was immediate. GM lost nearly 1/4 of its duty-free import quota. As a result, every GM vehicle shipped from the United States into Canada was suddenly subject to a 25% tariff. A model that previously sold for around $45,000 now approached $56,000. No dealership could absorb the increase. No consumer would willingly pay it. The financial pressure hit GM's leadership far faster than any public criticism could have. Stellantis faced even harsher penalties, losing half of its tariff-free allowance. The government made it clear that more consequences would follow if corporate commitments continued to be ignored. The message relied not on emotion but on structured policy backed by real force. For decades, corporations had assumed Canada needed them more than they needed Canada. This moment suggested that the balance of power was shifting, and that the era of quiet concessions might finally be coming to an end. For years, corporations had assumed that Canada would bend under pressure, adjusting its policies whenever the threat of lost investment appeared. That belief had become part of the corporate playbook. But the new framework fundamentally disrupted that assumption. Canada made it clear that it would no longer allow relocation threats or vague promises to shape national economic decisions. The tariffs were not improvised responses. They were built on rules established long before the conflict began. And when Canada enforced those rules without hesitation, it signaled the arrival of a new era in its economic strategy. The implications stretched far beyond tariff percentages. What mattered was a shift in leverage. Canada embraced a structured approach that removed guesswork, removed emotion, and removed the long-standing imbalance between governments and multinational corporations. For the first time in many years, major companies found themselves adjusting to Canada's expectations instead of treating the country as a flexible stop on their production map. Word traveled quickly across boardrooms in North America. Commitments tied to public investment were no longer symbolic gestures. They were enforceable obligations. As soon as the tariff penalties took effect, GM urgently requested meetings with federal officials. The company's earlier silence rested on the assumption that there would be no real consequence for ignoring its commitments. But the financial impact was immediate and difficult to absorb. Now the situation demanded attention. During those meetings, Minister Mélanie Joly presented a direct, uncompromising requirement. GM had 15 days to produce a complete production plan for Ingersoll. The document had to include specific vehicle models, defined timelines, and confirmation of how the plant will be integrated into GM's broader North American strategy. Ambiguous statements would not be accepted, and if GM failed to comply, the tariffs would remain in place indefinitely. Other automakers reacted quickly. Ford paused internal planning to assess the danger of overlooking Canadian policy expectations. Stellantis reshaped its leadership team in Canada and began demonstrating cooperation at a speed that reflected a new understanding of the risks. Executives who once assumed Canada would always compromise now recognized that the rules had changed, and that failing to adapt could bring immense financial consequences. After several weeks, GM's situation evolved into a larger example for the entire industry. A corporation that once viewed Canada as a low-risk production base was forced to reconsider what it meant to break commitments in a country that had found its voice. The framework guiding Canada's response was not dependent on political mood or public outrage. It was rooted firmly in policy. That consistency created a new kind of predictability, one that corporations could no longer afford to overlook. For the families in Ingersoll, the government's actions offered a degree of recognition that had been missing for a long time. Their work had supported one of Canada's core industries, and they had endured the uncertainty that comes when promises shift or disappear. Many felt that, for the first time in years, the government used its authority in a way that reflected their value. Workers in other sectors took notice as well. Technology, energy, and healthcare employees watched closely, understanding that this moment could shape future negotiations and redefine the balance between public investment and corporate responsibility. At the same time, another geopolitical shift was unfolding. China restored Canada to its approved travel list for group tourism. Ministerial visits increased. Diplomatic conversations became warmer, something few would have predicted a year earlier. Yet this renewed engagement carried an undercurrent of caution. Analysts warned that China likely recognized an opportunity to widen the distance between Ottawa and Washington. Michael Kovrig, returning to international policy work after his release, noted that China often benefits when Western allies drift out of alignment. Even with those risks, both countries saw practical reasons to rebuild communication. Canada had imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles alongside the United States, and China retaliated with steep duties on Canadian agricultural goods. Canola exports plummeted instantly, leaving farmers exposed to a conflict far beyond their control. With tensions rising simultaneously with the United States, Canada found itself pressured from both sides. Negotiations with Washington had briefly seemed to gain traction before collapsing again, this time after a widely publicized anti-tariff advertisement from Ontario. In response, President Trump paused discussions once more, placing Canada in an increasingly vulnerable position. With the United States as Canada's primary trading partner, the consequences of prolonged stalemate were impossible to ignore. Inside Ottawa, attitudes shifted as the situation grew more precarious. Experts observed that Canada's tone toward China softened in a way that reflected economic necessity rather than ideological change. Lin Etong described the shift as a strategic recalibration, born out of the need to manage escalating pressure. Ontario Premier Doug Ford added political momentum by publicly advocating for renewed stability with China. Beijing responded quickly, signaling that agricultural tariffs could be reduced if Canada reconsidered its position on electric vehicle imports. Public opinion also moved in unexpected directions. Surveys show that Canadians were increasingly likely to view the United States, not China, as a larger economic threat. The shift did not erase negative views of China, which remained strong, but it reflected frustration with ongoing trade tensions and the sharp impact of stalled negotiations. The perception of old alliances had grown more uncertain in the face of mounting pressure. Some analysts emphasize that Canada's outreach to China should be understood as pragmatic rather than symbolic. Fen Hampson argued that when a major export market becomes unstable, governments naturally explore alternatives. The goal was not to replace traditional partners, but to diversify during